It began not on a red carpet, but in silence, the kind of silence that follows when a truth too gentle to be scandalous, yet too beautiful to be denied, finally finds its voice. At 59, in a quiet studio interview flooded with afternoon light, Sandra Bullock finally spoke the words that millions had waited decades to hear. "I think we both loved each other, we just didn't want to lose what we already had." The interviewer froze. So did the world. For 30 years, audiences had called it the perfect chemistry. From Speed to the Lake House, every shared glance, every laugh between takes, seemed charged with something that neither time nor reason could erase. Yet neither of them ever crossed the invisible line between friendship and fate. Behind the applause and the tabloids that insisted they must have been together, there were only two people guarding something fragile, a connection too sacred to perform. She was the sunlit extrovert whose laughter could fill a room. He, the quiet storm of Hollywood, all gravity and grace. Together they built one of cinema's most believable illusions and then spent the rest of their lives protecting it from reality. But when Sandra's voice trembled that day, the illusion shattered, revealing something deeper, that not every great love is meant to be lived, some are meant to be remembered. For Keanu Reeves, who had already buried the woman he once planned to marry, love had long been a word edged with grief. For Sandra, who had survived betrayal and public heartbreak, love was something to be earned slowly, not stolen from chance. And so they stayed within the boundaries, two stars orbiting the same light, never colliding, never fading. What neither of them expected was that silence itself would become their legacy, the silence between takes, the pause before a smile, the unspoken promise that nothing needed to be said aloud to be true. In that silence lies the real story. The story of two people who could have been everything to each other if only life had arrived 5 minutes earlier. As the cameras kept rolling, Sandra's eyes glistened. She smiled, almost apologetically, and whispered, "He's the kindest person I've ever known." The audience heard tenderness, but between the lines lived another confession, a lifetime of unsent letters, unspoken phone calls, and the ache of knowing that the right soul can come at the wrong time. This is not a tale of scandal or betrayal. It is a portrait of restraint, of how destiny sometimes introduces two hearts only to teach them how to let go. And so we begin not with a love story, but with a question. Is it still love if it never happened? Before there was silence, there was light. A bright Los Angeles morning in 1993, a film set humming with nervous energy, cables coiled on the ground, and a blue bus waiting under the California sun. Sandra Bullock, then 29, had just landed her first major studio role. Keanu Reeves, already the face of quiet rebellion after Point Break and My Own Private Idaho, arrived without entourage or attitude, carrying a motorcycle helmet and a paperback book. When she saw him for the first time, she later said, "He was different." Stillness surrounded him. He was polite to everyone, the stuntmen, the lighting crew, even the interns, but distant, as if he were passing through a world that moved too fast for him. Sandra, meanwhile, was all spontaneity and laughter, the woman who could make the whole crew forget they were working 15-hour days. Director Jan de Bont would later recall that when the two of them stood together in the first camera test, something happened that no lighting adjustment or lens change could improve. The air between them seemed to shift charged, invisible, undeniable. "That was the moment I knew," the director said. No acting was required. They just looked at each other, and the story was already there. When Speed premiered, the audience believed they were watching an action film. What they didn't expect was the undercurrent of tenderness beneath the explosions. In every frame, the trembling bus, the impossible jump, the final escape, there was something unscripted, a trust that transcended performance. He caught her before she fell, she smiled before he spoke. It wasn't choreography. It was instinct. The press called it lightning in a bottle. Fans called it love. Overnight, they became the new definition of Hollywood chemistry. Two people who seemed made for each other, but who, inexplicably, never were. Their names began to appear side by side in magazines and radio shows. Are Keanu and Sandra the next great love story? But behind those glossy covers, both actors hid in opposite corners of the same truth. Keanu, haunted by private loss, had already learned that fame could turn tenderness into spectacle. He had seen too many private moments turned into public headlines. Sandra, rising quickly into America's sweetheart, feared the same trap that one real emotion could be mistaken for a publicity stunt. So they laughed off the rumors, protecting something unnamed between them by pretending it didn't exist. Yet every time they were asked about each other, their denials carried the softness of confession. "We just get along really well," she would say. Smiling, "She's amazing," he would answer, then fall silent, as if one more word might betray too much. Years passed. Speed became a cult classic, the film that turned a bus into a metaphor for momentum you can't control, and two strangers into symbols of what might have been. Sandra's star rose. She became a producer, an Oscar winner, a household name. Keanu, ever elusive, drifted between blockbusters and grief, losing both his unborn child and his partner, Jennifer Sim, within a single year. Hollywood continued to chase them with cameras, waiting for the moment they might finally meet again. That moment came in 2006, when destiny, or perhaps nostalgia, reunited them for the lake house. Different decade, different story. Same eyes. The film was about two souls separated by time, writing letters across a gap that reality refused to close. When Sandra read the script, she told the producers, "If we're going to tell a story about time and longing, it has to be him." Keanu said yes without hesitation. On set, it was as if nothing had changed. Their rhythms aligned instantly, the glances, the laughter, the quiet spaces in between. Crew members whispered that they didn't even need direction, they simply understood each other. A journalist who visited the shoot wrote, "Watching them rehearse was like watching two old friends who had once loved each other and never said goodbye." When the Lake House premiered, critics noticed something the script couldn't explain: the way their chemistry felt aged, deepened, as if carrying the memory of another life. The audience cried not because the characters were apart, but because it felt like watching Keanu and Sandra themselves, the love story they never had, reenacted through fiction. Still, even then, neither of them crossed the line. They met for dinners, exchanged birthday gifts, sent flowers, gestures of care carefully placed at a distance. Once, Sandra admitted on a talk show, "I think about him all the time, but not like that. He's Keanu." The crowd laughed, but the look in her eyes, that familiar blend of affection and restraint, told another story. And Keanu, asked in another interview if he ever had a crush on her, smiled and replied softly, "She didn't know I had one on her." It was the confession that arrived 25 years too late and yet perfectly on time for the legend to continue. For the world, their image remained untarnished. Two movie stars who had everything, and yet seemed to carry a quiet loneliness that made them human. They were the what if that Hollywood could never stop dreaming about. Because sometimes, the most perfect picture isn't of two people in love, it's of two people who almost were. And behind every magazine smile, behind every talk show joke, lay the illusion that bound them. That pretending not to be in love was the only way to protect what love had already given them. Every illusion carries a cost. For Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, that cost was silence, a silence so carefully built it became its own kind of devotion. Behind the radiant premieres and playful interviews, there was a pact neither had spoken aloud. We don't cross the line. We don't let the story own us. It wasn't written or rehearsed. It simply existed, the invisible script they both followed for decades. Because what the world never saw was how much loss Keanu carried inside him. He was 23 when he buried his best friend, River Phoenix. He was 36 when he lost the woman he loved, Jennifer Sim, and their stillborn daughter. By the time he met Sandra again, grief had already become his native language. To love someone, for him, meant to risk watching them vanish. And Sandra, vibrant, grounded, seemingly invincible, understood that pain without asking for details. She, too, had walked through her share of betrayals, lovers who used her fame, a marriage that collapsed under deceit, years spent pretending that heartbreak was just another plotline. They never needed to exchange confessions. Their silences spoke fluently. On the set of The Lake House, there were days when the director found them sitting side by side between takes, saying nothing at all, not out of boredom, but because there was nothing left to explain. Keanu once told a friend, "With her, I don't have to perform." Sandra later echoed, "He listens without trying to fix you." That's rare. It was that rarest kind of intimacy, the one that asks for nothing and gives everything. But the same sensitivity that drew them together also kept them apart. For Sandra, whose life had been dissected by tabloids, the idea of another public romance felt unbearable. Every smile would be misread, every gesture turned into gossip. And Keanu, who guarded his privacy like an old wound, refused to turn real affection into spectacle. To love openly in their world would have been defeated to the crowd. So, they chose preservation over passion, a quiet friendship that outlasted the flames. But deep down, both knew that choice carried a kind of sadness, the kind that follows you like a reflection you can't escape. In one 2018 interview, Sandra admitted she often thought about their time on Speed. "There was something about him," she said, her voice almost breaking. "It was safe, like he could see me before I knew who I was." That confession revealed more than she intended. Because the truth was, Keanu had seen her not as the Hollywood star or the romantic lead, but as the woman beneath all of that. He saw the exhaustion behind the perfection, the fear behind the smile. And she saw him not as the immortal loner that the press adored, but as the man who carried ghosts quietly, who moved through grief with grace, because to stop moving would mean to fall apart. Their secret wasn't an affair or a hidden romance. It was something subtler, more human, the decision to love without claiming, to care without naming, to be present without possession. There was, however, one moment when that balance nearly broke. It happened after the Lake House wrap. The crew had thrown a small farewell party at a quiet restaurant in Chicago. Sandra, dressed simply in black, arrived late. Keanu was already there, sitting near the window, his motorcycle gloves on the table. They hugged long, familiar, not for the cameras. When they pulled apart, she looked at him and said softly, "You know, we could have been great." He smiled. Not the movie star smile, the quiet one that hides pain behind politeness. "Yeah," he said. "But maybe this is better." Better. The word lingered between them like unfinished dialogue. That night, she went home and cried not because of what hadn't happened, but because of what had, the realization that love, in its purest form, sometimes refuses to become a story. He didn't follow her. He never did. Instead, he sent her a note a few days later, written in his unhurried handwriting. "You deserve everything you give. Thank you for making kindness look easy." No signature. None was needed. Over the years, they would drift in and out of each other's, orbit a lunch here, a call there, a quiet congratulations after a premiere. Every meeting carried the same undercurrent, affection tempered by discipline. Sandra once said in an interview, "I wish everyone could have a Keanu in their life." It sounded casual, almost playful, but it was a truth disguised as a joke. Because Keanu wasn't a chapter in her story. He was the margin, the quiet space that made everything else readable. In turn, she became his reminder that joy was still possible, that the world hadn't taken everything. Whenever he appeared on red carpets or charity events, journalists asked if he was lonely. He would smile, shrug, and answer, "I have good friends." He never said her name, but he didn't have to. For both, what began as cinematic chemistry became something far more enduring, a shared code of emotional survival. They had learned that love doesn't always require union. Sometimes it demands distance, a distance that protects both the feeling and the people who carry it. Yet even distance cannot erase memory. Years later, when Sandra lost her longtime partner to illness, she disappeared from the public eye. For months, she was unseen, unheard. But friends said flowers arrived at her home regularly, simple white orchids, always without a card. She never said who sent them. She didn't need to, because some gestures don't need names. They need only the quiet certainty of being understood. Their secret, then, was not the absence of love. It was the discipline to love silently. And in a world where love is often shouted, flaunted, and sold, silence can be the most romantic act of all. Keanu and Sandra, two lives moving in parallel, connected by something time could not erase, distance could not diminish, and fame could not define. They were never a couple. They were never apart. And that paradox, perhaps, was the truest thing about them. It had been decades since that first ride on a bus that wouldn't stop. The years had done what years always do. They blurred the edges of fame, softened faces, and replaced adrenaline with reflection. Yet when Sandra Bullock spoke his name again at 59, the room fell silent, as if time itself paused to listen. She was sitting across from a journalist in a sunlit room in New Orleans, her voice calm, her smile faint. The question was simple. "Do you ever think about Keanu Reeves?" Her laugh was small, almost shy. Then came the pause, the kind that carries more truth than a sentence ever could. "Finally," she said, "all the time." For a moment, it was 1994 again. The bus was roaring through Los Angeles, and a man with dark hair was reaching out his hand to pull her from the wreckage. But this time, the rescue was emotional, not cinematic. Sandra continued, "We never dated. We just didn't want to ruin anything. I think we both knew what it was, and we didn't need to name it." The journalist leaned forward, stunned. The camera caught the shimmer in her eyes, the softness of a memory that had never truly ended. And somewhere across the city, perhaps at that very moment, Keanu Reeves, older now, quieter, hair streaked with silver, might have smiled without knowing why. Because that was how it had always been between them, a connection that didn't need words to exist. When the lake house turned 20, fans began revisiting interviews, searching for clues, compiling every glance, every offhand compliment. What they found wasn't scandal, it was something far more intimate, two lives running parallel, never intersecting, yet always aware of each other's shadow. He once said in a 2019 interview, "Life doesn't have to give you everything you want. Sometimes, it gives you what you need quietly." It was, perhaps, his way of saying her name without saying it. Because what he needed was never ownership. It was understanding. And that she had given him from the start. In 2020, after years of silence between them, they were reunited at an awards gala in Los Angeles. The night was bright with flashbulbs and applause. But when she saw him across the room, it felt like an echo of an older, gentler world. He was still the same, the calm in a storm of noise. She walked up to him. For a brief second, the crowd vanished. Witnesses later said it was the simplest thing, two people smiling, embracing, holding on longer than necessary. But those who were close enough saw something else, her eyes glistening, his hand trembling slightly against her back. They spoke only briefly. No cameras caught their words. But a sound technician nearby swore he heard her whisper, "You're still my favorite co-star." And Keanu's reply, almost inaudible, "You were never just that." A few hours later, he left early, as he always did. She watched him disappear into the crowd, the man who had taught her that real love could exist without beginning or end. The following year, tragedy touched Sandra's life again. The partner she had quietly loved for years, Brian Randall, passed away after a long illness. For months, she withdrew from the public, choosing silence over spectacle. Those close to her said she barely spoke, that she filled her days with small routines, watering plants, walking her dogs, watching old movies with her children. And then, one morning, a small delivery arrived at her gate, a bouquet of white orchids, tied with a simple black ribbon. No note, no name, just a single card that read, "For every moment that never needed words." Her assistant asked if she wanted to keep it. Sandra smiled softly. "Of course," she said. "He means well." No one asked who he was. They didn't have to. Because sometimes, when grief comes, love answers even from a distance. Meanwhile, Keanu carried on as he always had, quietly, compassionately, with a kind of stillness that defied the chaos of Hollywood. He attended premieres, rode his motorcycle through the city at dusk, spoke little about his private life. But when asked once about Sandra, he paused before answering. "She's someone who stays with you," he said simply, "even when she's not around." It was the most public confession he ever made. Time moved forward, as it always does. They would occasionally cross paths at a charity event, a private dinner, a phone call on a birthday. Each time, the same unspoken rule held: no past tense, no future tense, only the now. And yet, something about that restraint made their connection immortal. Because love, once denied the chance to burn out, learns how to glow quietly for a lifetime. In her later interviews, Sandra began speaking more openly about kindness, about loss, about the people who had kept her heart safe. Though she never named him, every word carried his shape. "He's one of the few people," she said once, "who reminds you that goodness can be powerful, that you can be gentle and still change the world." She paused, smiled faintly, and added, "He's probably going to hate that I said that." The audience laughed, but there was a tremor in her voice, a private ache disguised as humor. Because in every life, there's one person who changes your definition of love without ever claiming it. Their story had no kiss, no wedding, no dramatic farewell. Just two souls who found a rare stillness in each other, and who kept that stillness alive long after the cameras stopped rolling. If love is a story, theirs was written in the spaces between the lines, in the glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. The letters never sent. The years carried quietly, faithfully, without expectation. They never needed to say, "I love you." The world said it for them. And in that collective imagination, that dream shared by millions, perhaps they finally found what time denied them in life. A love that belonged to no one, yet belonged to everyone. Sometimes the biggest shock is not betrayal, not scandal, not loss. It's discovering that love doesn't have to happen to be real. and for Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. That truth was both their tragedy and their grace. There are love stories that change the world, and others that quietly preserve it. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock never kissed under wedding bells or walked red carpets hand in hand. Yet somehow in the collective memory of millions, they remain one of the most enduring pairs Hollywood ever created. Maybe because their story was never about romance. It was about reverence. About two people who recognized the sacredness of connection and chose not to damage it by naming it too loudly. In an industry built on spectacle, they offered restraint. In a culture obsessed with possession, they offered respect. What we call the chemistry that time forgot was, in truth, a quiet lesson in emotional maturity and knowing that love can exist without ownership, that affection does not require performance, and that sometimes the deepest intimacy lies in the distance we maintain. Keanu once said, "Grief and love are twins. They live in the same house." Perhaps that's why he and Sandra understood each other so deeply. Both had lived with ghosts. Both had learned that nothing lasts forever. And both chose kindness over chaos. When she lost her partner, he sent orchids instead of words, because words might have reopened wounds. When he suffered yet another loss, she sent silence because silence can be prayer. They never declared love. They simply practiced it. And in doing so, they revealed a truth we often forget: that love isn't proven by its outcome, but by its endurance. If you look back at their story, from the speeding bus to the quiet interviews, from laughter in the rain to tears unseen, you realize something profound. They didn't fail to fall in love. They succeeded in not destroying what love had already given them. Every fleeting glance on screen was a dialogue between two souls who had made peace with what they could never have. Every interview, every laugh, every word unsaid was an act of grace, the kind that transforms longing into loyalty. In a world that rewards noise, they taught us the poetry of gentle